Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Looks like the sun is finally peeking out after the deluge we had yesterday, but much needed rain, as all the farmers would say. My name is Candace Summers. I'm the Senior Director of Education here at the McLean County Museum of History, and I want to thank you for coming to today's Lunch and Learn featuring Buck Farley, who is the archivist at State Farm. Super excited to get to share some stories I've been calling from the vault there at State Farm. But before I turn things over to Buck, I want to thank our Lunch and Learn sponsor, MCK CPAs and Advisors, and our live stream sponsor, WGLT, your local public media, which is part of the NPR network. I also want to remind everybody that today's program is being live streamed and recorded, so if you don't want it to live on the internet forever, please mind your P's and Q's. Also, at the end of the program, we'll have time for question and answers. I'll come around with the microphone so that our friends online can hear your questions before Buck gives them an answer. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Buck Farley.
Thank you. Well, it is nice to see so many people interested in the history of auto insurance. I'm glad to see everybody here. I'll make this as riveting as I possibly can for everybody. So we're going to talk about, obviously, the founding of the company, a little bit about how what George did here in the community, how the community was a big part of State Farm in the beginning. But I'm also I want to do like the full 100 years and give you guys a picture of the innovations that have continued at State Farm that has kept us the industry leader throughout the years. So I'm going to share some of that stuff with you as well. But to kick it all off, we're going to talk about our founder, George Mecherle. George Mecherle was a farmer, as we all know, I hope. He farmed actually not very far from where we're standing right now, just outside of a little town called Myrna, Illinois. You can still see the family farm today if you drive out on Route 9. It's about 5 miles outside of town, and you'll see a big sign in a front yard that says the Mecherle Family Trust. He's born there in 1877, and he farms the property with his father and his uncle until about 1899. And in 1899, he buys his own farm. And if you remember where the Ovation Theater was on the east side of town, that's kind of where his farm was at. The city's almost completely engulfed that area now. But while he was on that farm, he really made a name for himself in the local community. He was known for assisting farmers that had fallen on hard times, never expecting to be paid back. He sat on the board of several mutual companies. One was the Old Town Pekin, and the other one was the local Farm Bureau. So he was very familiar with how mutual organizations worked, and was always famous for saying, if I can sell one, I can sell a million. And then in 1917, his wife, May Mecherle, is diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And this begins a big change in George's life because the doctor says the Illinois climate is terrible for that type of illness. You should really pick your family up and move somewhere that is a better climate for her. So he does. He picks his family up and he moves to Florida. What's a farmer to do in Florida in 1918? Not a whole lot. It's a bunch of swampland and beachfront property for sale. But George was always famous for saying, if I can sell one, I can sell a million, so he decides he's going to become a real estate agent. He gets ready to set up his business, and before he can do so, his wife approaches him and says, honey, it is too damn hot and the bugs are too big. We are going back to Illinois. So he packs his family up and he heads back here to Illinois, and instead of going back to farming, he tries his hand at selling auto insurance for a local company called Union Automotive Insurance Company. And here, I need to probably explain to everybody what auto insurance looked like in 1918. And to do that, I need to go all the way back to 1898. So in 1898, the first auto policy in the United States is sold by Travelers Insurance in New York City. Does anybody know what time period in American history 1898 falls within? You don't count, Bill. You can't answer that one. No, the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age means a thin layer of gold over a rusty piece of metal, because 80% of the United States was at or below poverty level in 1898. So that means that policy that Travelers Insurance created was not meant for a majority of Americans. That was meant for a very select group of people, right? This policy was not risk assessed. These people had all the money. they didn't need to worry about risk assessment. They could pay whatever price was put on the policy. You only got one coverage, liability, and that was just to cover their butts in case they hurt somebody or got somebody killed. Otherwise, if they needed to buy a new car, they had enough money to do that. And finally, you only made one payment a year. Well, there was only one group of Americans that could do that in the United States that had a savings account, and that was the top 20%. So George is trying to sell this policy in 1918 to farmers. What a lot of people don't realize is farmers had already entered a Great Depression right after World War I, right? We were told them to ramp up production of their food for the Allies, and then the war's over and they have all this surplus, and they go into an economic collapse. Farmers were making less than $500 a year. And George is trying to sell this New York policy to these farmers. What do you think they're going to say? You're crazy. I can't afford that. And one payment a year? And there's hardly any coverages on that. How is that going to help me out? So George thinks on this a minute. He realizes there's ways to correct this. So he goes to his leadership and he says, look, number one, we should do a risk assessment on these policyholders. Let's lower the risk on them. They're farmers. They don't drive as much as those city folks do, right? And number two, let's go to a 6-month premium. That way, that helps them out a little bit. Plus, we'll have extra money coming in every month and can build that surplus up that we need to be able to lower that premium even further. And they look at him at Union Automotive and they say, George, you're crazy. That's not how insurance works. If you think you can do better than us, go start your own business. So he quits. He becomes a tractor salesman next. He does really good at that. He worked for the Illinois Tractor Company. It was based here in Bloomington. He was selling the Illinois Super Drive at the time, and he was what they would call a bird dog. He was supposed to be the guy that goes out, hunts for a farmer that needs the tractor, and then come back and tell the salesman, I found one for you, you can go out and sell him the tractor now. But he didn't like the way that the salesmen were selling the tractors, so he just took it on himself to sell the tractors. Well, he did so well that they end up having to back order the tractor for like 2 years because he's selling them so fast. While he's doing this, George also has this idea of this insurance company rolling around in his head. And what he does is he talks to a local council here in town, a lawyer by the name of Adlai Rust. He tells Adlai his idea, and he was an acquaintance of Adlai's. They had known each other, and Adlai was very business savvy. He was very good with finances. And he suggests that, George, if you're serious about wanting to start this auto company, you should look at farm bureaus. That would be a good place to start. Farm bureaus at this time period were fire mutual companies, owned and operated by farmers. He's like, you know what? That's a great idea. But he didn't like one thing about them. He didn't like the way they were organized. At this time period, the Farm Bureau only went up to the county level. So in Illinois alone, we had 102 separate operating farm bureaus, right? That was hard for some counties that had lower economy, and those farm bureaus had struggled to survive. So George is like, well, first off, I can't do this fragmented by county thing. That's not going to work. But you know what? I think I can do the same thing that they're doing for the most part, except I'll do it with an auto policy. Instead of selling by county, I'll sell statewide, and I'll make my business just selling to farmers, hence the name State Farm. The only problem is the United States was coming off of a global pandemic in 1918, and the economy was wrecked. So when he's trying to get a loan to start this business, no banks are loaning him money. So what's a guy to do if no bank's going to loan you money? He's going to randomly go around and just ask people to give him money because he's got a good idea, right? I think we call this a Kickstarter today. It's online. But back then, you had to talk to people face to face. So George goes out, and we actually have accounts of Bloomington residents that would see George Mecherle walking down the street, and they would dive down side alleys or turn a corner just to avoid this man because they didn't want to listen to his crazy ideas. But one day, somebody actually stopped and listened to him. It was a woman by the name of Minnie Jones. Minnie Jones was an insurance genius for her day. She made many companies very successful, which in turn made her very wealthy. So George pitches this idea of a farm mutual company that can sell auto insurance statewide to farmers. She thinks they can take a go at it, so she gives him 40% to buy a $25,000 license fee, and on June 8th, the company is founded. Now, if you're a State Farm employee or a former one, you're going to be like, wait a minute, we celebrated that on June 7th. What's he talking about? I hate to tell you all, you've been lied to your whole career. The actual founding date was June the 8th. So why do we celebrate it on June 7th? George Mecherle was a bit of a storyteller. And once rumors got out that he founded the company on his birthday, he just let people run with it. So that's why we celebrated on the wrong day. But on June 8th, Minnie Jones is voted in as the first female executive of State Farm. That's pretty progressive for the time period when you think about it. Women had just gotten the right to vote in 1920. And she was appointed as treasurer of State Farm. Most women in the United States can't even get their own bank accounts without a man on the account with them until nearly the 1970s. And yet Minnie Jones was the treasurer of State Farm in 1922. About a week goes by after George has founded the company. Him and his brothers are the ones out doing it. We had a gentleman named Charles Wonderland, who was a friend of his that we consider the first agent of State Farm because he did it full time for us. But that first week, after that week, he gets everybody back together and he says, hey, look, while I was out this week, I started to think, we are an insurance company, so there's really going to be a really good possibility we're going to get sued at some point, right? I mean, it's part of our business. If you've been in insurance, if you worked in insurance, that's part of the settlement process. If you don't like the settlement being presented to you by the insurance company, you have the option to take it into arbitration, and that requires a judge and lawyers to hash out the settlement. And he knew this process, and he just happened to know a lawyer who was his friend. So he takes off to Founders Grove. And he pulls up outside a house located at 1911 East Jackson Street. The house still stands there today. I believe there's a State Farm employee that actually lives in the house today. But back in 1922, that was the Rust home. And it just so happened that on that day, Adlai Rust was working in his flower garden. So George got out of the car, approached Adlai and said, Adlai, I started that company I talked to you about. I would love you to join State Farm as our general counsel. And Adlai looked at him and laughed in his face and said, absolutely not. You just started this business a week ago. Are you crazy? But I'll tell you what, I'll help you out part-time. We'll see how busy you get. You bring me the cases as you get them, we'll work them out. But in the meantime, what Adlai Rust does is he sits on our board of directors. And what Adlai begins to do is begins to build the operational side of our business. What George Mecherle was focused on was agency and the product, right? So after this conversation with Adlai, a few more weeks go by and we realized we had all these applications stacking up on a desk, but we actually didn't hire anybody to process them. By the way, I forgot to mention, the very first State Farm office was actually where Main Plaza is today, or where Red Raccoon is down the street here. It used to be the Durley building. That was our very first office. But anyway, we had all these applications stacked up, but we didn't have anybody process the applications, so we decided to hire the first employee of State Farm, which was Verna Crucius. She's our stenographer, claim handler, underwriter, check writer, auditor. She does it all. She did it all for $21 for working 60 hours a week. By the end of that year, we had about 1,500 policies in place. It doesn't sound like a lot because I think we have over 93 million today, but back then it was a lot. We need more space. And George also needs an agency force. His policy is a lot more popular than he ever thought it would be. He's created something that appeals to almost 80% of the population. So needless to say, everybody wants it. But he didn't have enough salespeople to do it. But the problem with it is that the market that he wanted to sell to was inaccessible in 1922, right? Farmers don't leave the farm. It's a subsistence lifestyle. They grow their own food, they have their own water, they just come into town to sell products whenever harvest happens, right? There's no telephones, because it's 1922, we can't call these people, right? And the main mode of transportation around here was a horse. So the second you leave city limits, it's mud until you get to the next town. So how do you get to people you can't reach, and how do you sell to them? Somehow the farm bureaus were doing it. In order to be an agent for the Farm Bureau, you had to be a member of the Farm Bureau. In order to be a member of the Farm Bureau, you had to be a farmer. These were the neighbors to the people that George Mecherle wanted to sell insurance to. So I guess you could say they're going to become the first good neighbors of State Farm. Because in 1923, George Mecherle walks down to the McLean County Farm Bureau and he says, look, you guys already have a fire policy you're selling. I have this really great auto policy, trust me. If you sell it, I'll give you commission and we'll use your office to process all your applications. They agree to help us out and our agents are born. Our agents are actually farm bureaus until the 1950s, and I'll go through that transition a little bit later. But we move into this building in 1923, and this becomes the second office of State Farm, and we all know this building today as the Golden Dragon Chinese restaurant downtown. So it's going well now. We have an agency force, and something amazing happens once we form this alliance with the farm bureaus. The Illinois Farm Bureau is formed for the first time. They realized that this fragmentation, yeah, George is right, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to do something else. And they formed this Illinois Farm Bureau now, so now it's at the state level. And once we do that here, all the states around us start calling George. Hey, George, we need you to come into our state and do the same thing. Will you form an alliance with our farm bureaus as well? And George's like, nope, I want to make sure I'm well established in Illinois first. I'll let you know when we're ready to leave. And it's not for another 2 years almost before we leave. In 1925, we leave the state of Illinois for the first time. And the first state that we move into is Indiana, then Missouri, then South Dakota. And all the while we're doing this, we are forming these alliances with the Farm Bureau. And what's really interesting about this time period is George's philosophy on marketing. Our founder's philosophy on marketing was, the wagging tongue of a happy policyholder is the only advertising I need. And he set our budget at $16 a year to market with. But from 1925 until 1928, we spread to 20 states all the way to California. We're already opening a branch office in Berkeley, and we did that by word of mouth. That is how coveted of a product he had created in the 1920s. And within 7 short years, by 1929, we are now looking at starting the life company of State Farm. We're talking about building a home office here, and we begin construction of that, which it is completed in 1929. The life company is founded in 1929, and Adlai Rust comes in full-time in 1929. And it's a good thing he did. George had gotten to know Adlai very well over these last 7 years, as Adlai sat on the board of directors, and realized Adlai was a bit of an economist for a hobby. He was very attuned to the economic climate of the United States in the late 1920s. So when Adlai comes in, Adlai makes a suggestion. He's in about June, July of 1929. He says, look, we should probably take all of our investments that we have and move them into bonds, because I have a feeling something's about ready to happen to the stock market. So we did. And man, was he right. Because on October 29th, 1929, the Great Depression begins. And the economy collapses. People are forced from their homes. Over 400,000 Americans are evicted from their homes and move into what we know as Hoovervilles, homeless communities across the United States. Why were they called Hoovervilles? Because President Herbert Hoover was in charge at the time, so he took the blame. It wasn't a good time at all in American history, but what happened to State Farm? Because of the move that Adlai Rust made to protect our investments, the 1930s end up being one of the most prosperous decades in State Farm's history. And one reason why we were able to do that, we're a mutual company. We don't have shareholders demanding that they need those profits, right? So we were able to keep our rates the lowest level during the Great Depression for those people that needed it the most. We grow in property, people, policies, companies, technology, all the way to the #2 auto company in the United States by 1938. And that was done mainly due to Adlai Rust's move. We are celebrating the 90th anniversary of our fire company this year. It was founded in 1935, one of the worst years of the Great Depression, and yet we were founding this new company. A lot of people assume that it started selling homeowners insurance in 1935, but it didn't. We actually don't sell a homeowner's policy out of this company until 1956, almost 21 years after it's founded. You see, when the fire company is founded, the United States, even though the New Deal was passed in '33, it's going to take a while to get all those regulations integrated into our society. So it's still kind of the time period of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies a little bit in 1935. And to be honest with you, by this point in State Farm's history, we're kind of like a Rockefeller in the sense that every state we move into, the small mutuals couldn't compete with us, and most of them would be insolvent after a few years, and we would be one of the last mutuals standing in the state. So needless to say, those small mutuals would do whatever they could to try to slow our progression across the U.S. And in 1935, their move was to actually try to stop our entry into Wisconsin. We applied for a mutual license in Wisconsin, and when we do that, those small mutual companies got together, they formed this alliance amongst themselves, and they began to pool some resources together, and then they called their insurance commissioner on us, and they said, listen, we heard State Farm wants to come into this state to do business, and we think that is a terrible idea. So if you agree to keep State Farm out, we'll give you this big political donation this year to do so, and every year after, you'll get that political donation as long as they're kept out of the state. Of course, they're like, okay, I'll take care of State Farm, that sounds great. Calls us up, State Farm, I hate to tell you this, But the mutual market is too saturated here in Wisconsin. I'm not going to issue any more licenses, so good luck in the next state you go to, though. But unfortunately, once Wisconsin did it, a lot of the other states started to do it too. So if we had a law department back then, we probably would have sued them, but we don't have a law department until 1962. So we have to rely on outside advice. And what they advised us was if they're blocking the mutual companies, they're not going to block stocks, because then they can't let any business into their state. So we suggest you find the solution in that piece of advice. So we came back to Bloomington and we founded State Farm Fire Company, which is a stock company owned solely by State Farm Mutual. And in 1935, it wrote coverage on vehicles, and that's how we got around their blockades. It's not until World War II that we introduced perils on dwellings. But in order to insure your home, you have to write a policy for every peril you want covered. So you'd have a theft policy, a wind policy, fire, you had a lot of policies on your house, a lot to manage. But in 1950, small companies began to test out auto, fire, or homeowners insurance for the first time. And this is where State Farm's mutuality will shine once again. We may not be the inventors of a product line or a process in the insurance industry, but we do have the financial fortitude to sit back, watch others try stuff for a while, improve on it, and then put out a State Farm version of that product. And that's exactly what happened with homeowners insurance. We watched it for 5 years. All the while, we had a team on the inside building its own policy, and in 1955, we announced we finally had it. 1956, we sold the first one, and in less than a decade, by 1964, we were the #1 homeowners in the United States, and we have held that position for 61 years. Technology. We often think of technology today as cell phones or AI or quantum computing, but in 1930s, it was something as simple as a roller skate or a sewing machine. Workplace efficiency, we always want things to move faster at State Farm so we can meet the needs of our customers even better. And during World War II, it was no different. And that's why we gave our mail carriers roller skates to roller skate the mail around the office. Unfortunately for them, their coworkers would use this as an opportunity to build obstacle courses because it's only funny if somebody falls and spills the mail. And when somebody did just that, we decided it's probably too much of a liability, and we ended the process in 1944. If you were an underwriter at the beginning of our company in 1922, you were tasked with binding the applications and policies together, and the way that you would do that would sit at a big table with a stack of apps and a stack of policies and a big tub of glue, and you would just glue them all day long. And you might be able to get 50, maybe 60 done in an hour. You had to wait for them to dry, all that type of stuff. But in 1939, one of these underwriters decided to try their sewing machine out. And they went from 50 in an hour to 750 in an hour. So we buy a whole fleet of Singer sewing machines, and we sewed our apps and policies together until 1977, when somebody decided to buy a stapler, and it changed the whole thing. Also, you start to see things like employee benefits come out for the first time in the 1930s, right? The New Deal's been passed. Corporations kind of fall in line when major pieces of legislation are passed in the United States. And we established the medical division for the first time at State Farm. We noticed our employees were not going to the doctor like they should. And eating properly, we felt. We wanted to make sure they could be sustained in a full 8-hour day, and it was during the Great Depression, and grocery stores are gouging prices. We're not sure if they got food in the morning or not, so we want to make sure they're okay. So the first thing we do is we hire a doctor, we hire a couple nurses, and we gave the nurses a car. Each one had a car, and we called it the pill box. And if you weren't at work by 9 a.m., she was coming out to your house to find out why, right? Mainly because there's no telephones, you can't call into work sick, and most people were coming into work through the interurban, which was a trolley system that ran throughout Bloomington. And so if you're not on the trolley and you can't call into work, we need to make sure you're okay. So she'll come out to your house, she'll check you out, she'll make sure you're okay. If you need to stay home, she'll leave you a magazine or a newspaper. If you need to see the doctor, we'll bring you into the company doctor, and if you need to get medicine, don't worry about it, State Farm will cover the cost. And God forbid, you got to go to the hospital. But if you do, she will take you, and she will let the hospital know that any charges accrued should be sent to State Farm for payment. You see, there was no such thing as health insurance back then, so we kind of took on ourselves. And also, if you were playing hooky, she made you get back to the car and come back to work with her, which is why our attendance was at 98% back in the day. Also, we noticed some employees were not eating lunches, and if they're not eating lunches, are they eating breakfast? Like, do they have that? So the doctor decides to implement a program at State Farm called the Milk Program. The idea was that these people are malnourished. We need to make sure that they have sustenance so they can be healthy and hardy. So in 1936, if you were a skinny person at State Farm, the doctor would come around and tell you to go down to the medical department every day. And you had to drink whole milk twice a day. If you were really skinny or really underweight, he would make you drink buttermilk or heavy cream. And then we would keep track of how much weight you gained and put it in the employee publication called the Alfie for everybody to read. So between 1936 and 1938, we had 66 employees in the program, and they gained a total of 550 pounds. So it was a great program overall. We also had a baseball team that started around then, well, fast-pitch softball, really. We first called them the State Farm Varsity. They started about 1932, and it was made up of all State Farm leaders at first. But then we joined this thing called the Industrial League, which had like Coca-Cola and Caterpillar, and so we needed a more professional team. So we started to hire all these professional softball players to come into State Farm, and we'd give them a job in the mail room that they could go down, and then during baseball season we'd bring them up to play baseball, and they ended up becoming the State Farm Chiefs. And we used to play at what is now R.T. Dunn Field here in Bloomington off and on, but after a while, in 1947, they decided to buy a park south of town. It was called Lake Park when we bought it, but it had been Mini Park, Bongo Park, and Houghton Park and all that stuff. But we bought it, we put up a fence around it, and we built a softball field out there, and our Chiefs began to play out there. And it was a really big deal. It was one of the only times we would open the park to the public because the public just loved to come watch the Chiefs so much, to come play. And they did so well that in 1956, we were third place world champions. But then we sold them to Budweiser, and they became the Budweiser Chiefs. And then in 1958, they just disbanded the league completely. But remnants of them still exist with State Farm Park today, which is still an employee benefit for those of us that work at State Farm. So 1938 rolls around, and we have made it all the way to the number 2 auto company in the United States. The number 1 company in the U.S. is a company called General Exchange. They're owned by another company called General Motors. General Motors builds a car. You need to buy their car, but they'll finance you. They'll give you a loan, and on your loan comes an automatic insurance policy from General Exchange. You don't need 2 policies, and you can't dump the one on your loan, so you dump State Farm. This was problematic for us. George decides to hold what we call a rally cry at State Farm, and he calls it 1 million or more by 44. The idea was to get to 1 million total auto policies by 1944. George's thinking was, look, we have about 350,000 in place. General Exchange has about 420,000 in place, but if we can make it to 1 million by 1944, there's no way General Motors is building cars that fast. We'll just overtake them. So we kick off the campaign, and within the first year, our numbers don't go anywhere. They stay the same. There's another problem going on in the United States I've been talking about called the Great Depression. Remember, the banking system's collapsed. There's only community banks and credit unions left, and they don't want to loan you money until the economy is stabilized. So your only alternative for financing were high interest rate loans through auto manufacturers. George realizes the issue is not our product. It's there's no alternative to financing. And he starts to scrounge around with his leaders to see if there's a way to start a bank back in 1938. But there's not. There's a piece of legislation in place called the Glass-Steagall Act. So we would put our heads together and we would come up with something known as the bank plan, or what later generations at State Farm would know as the car finance plan. We're going to take a local agent, we're going to partner them with a community bank, and we're going to promise that bank will insure the vehicle over the life of the loan as long as they give a loan to our customer. It worked. Our numbers started to increase, but not at the rate we needed to overcome our goal. What does that is the most significant event of the 20th century. It's World War II. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese will bomb Pearl Harbor, and later that evening, Franklin Roosevelt will come over the radio and say, today is a day that will live in infamy. The Pacific Fleet has been destroyed and we have to go to war. You need to put yourself in the mindset of an American in 1941 being told by President Roosevelt that half of the Navy was just destroyed. The Japanese are still out there, and there is nobody to protect the California coast now. So what do you think Americans did the next day? They went to the grocery stores and they bought all the toilet paper. They bought all the food, they bought all the gasoline, and they began to hoard it. Why? Because we were faced with a crisis. We do it every single time. It's just human nature. We do it with plague, we do it with war, or we'll do it if there's going to be 6 inches of snow tomorrow. We'll find a way to clear those stores out. But the difference between March of 2020 and December of 1941 is we have a war to win, and we cannot allow our citizens to buy all this stuff. We need it. So Congress does something in 1942 that inadvertently actually helps us win our campaign. They passed a piece of legislation known as the Emergency Price Control Act of 1942. What this does, essentially, is shut down American society as we know it today and reopen it under government control. You want to buy groceries? That's fine. You have to acquire a ration book from the ration office, and you're only allowed so much food per month per family, dry goods, canned goods. You want fresh produce? Grow it yourself. 40% of fresh produce consumed in the United States was grown in victory gardens in people's backyards. Gasoline was at a premium, folks. We do not have the infrastructure in place today that we had in 1941. Gas stations were told they could no longer sell gas. We needed that fuel for all the war machines we were creating. And if you wanted gas, you had to apply for it through the ration office, and they had to deem your job worthy to the victory of the war, otherwise they told you to walk. But if you didn't walk, you got a ticket, you got maybe 30 gallons a month, so you were probably walking anyway. And finally, the Department of Defense, they did the most drastic thing of all. They take over all manufacturing in the United States, force them to shut down, and reopen them as war production plants. That means Ford, GM, Chevy, they're not making cars anymore. They're making tanks, they're making planes, and they're making ships. And we don't put policies on those because we're going to blow them up. General Exchange had $36 million in premium dollars in 1941, and we had $25 million. By the end of 1942, we still had $25 million, but they only had $8 million left. And we were announced as the #1 auto company in the United States, and we have held that position for 83 years. And with the collapse of General Exchange, that left a lot of customers needing a new company to go to, so we stepped into the breach and easily hit 1 million auto policies by 1944. So a huge success for State Farm. This man does not work for State Farm. He is my shout out to my grandfather. He's the reason why I'm a historian today. As a member of the greatest generation, Cecil Moore, he told me when I was a child that we die 2 deaths. We die the death when you physically die, and we die the death when your name is spoken for the last time. And that inspired me to become a historian, and I wanted to speak as many names as I could. So that's why I do what I do today. So thanks, Grandpa, I appreciate it. After the war did not have the best outcome for State Farm, though. We grew immensely during the war, but we didn't compensate our operations to compensate for that. Plus, when you have 5 years of people not driving, nobody building cars, people just sat around and walked for a while, and then they start driving all of a sudden 5 years later, guess what? They forgot how to drive, right? Our claims exploded. Plus, during the war, you couldn't repair your car, because there were no repair parts, right? So if you got in a wreck, you just had to wait till the war was over, pray to God we win the war, and then you can turn in a claim. Literally 5 years worth of auto claims came pouring into the downtown building in 1946. We didn't have a claims department like we do today. You see, claims was mainly handled by agents back then. The Farm Bureau agents were like a one-stop shop. They were the agent, the claim handler, and the underwriter. But these agents don't want to handle 5-year-old claims, so we're going to send it back to the home office to deal with. The claims office at the home office was staffed with only about 100 lawyers, because if a claim had made it to the home office, that meant there was a trial involved with it. They weren't equipped to handle this mass influx. State Farm had about $13 million in overhead in 1946, but we were losing $1 million a month. And it looked like there was a good chance we were going to be insolvent by the end of 1947. So George calls an emergency meeting, and he sets to task a brand new employee at State Farm who just come from the war. He was a communications officer in the Aleutian Islands. His name was Ed Rust. And he put him to task to reorganize the company. He said, look, I do not care how it looks to meet the demands of our customers. The only thing that is sacred to State Farm is the promise that we make that we will be there on their worst days. That can never change. So he created the Mr. X plan, which is what state farmers call the regional office structure. And we began opening regional facilities across the country. We're going to take claims out of the agent's hands, and we're going to establish a claims department and start training employees how to handle claims so that way we don't have to hire lawyers to do it. We're going to bring underwriting in-house now and train underwriters in State Farm, and we established the underwriting department. And then that services department there in the middle was actually what we call ad services today at State Farm, and it was to support those two functions in each facility that we opened across the United States. And by the time it was all said and done, we would have 28 regions across the United States and Canada by 1999. But as George is reorganizing operations, this is now going to take about a decade to get done. We are a much bigger company than we were 30 years prior to this, so it's going to take a while to get it done. George now wants to focus on agents because he's having a problem with these farm bureaus. These farm bureaus were more like brokers for us. They were not the beholden agents that we have today. And they did not have to sell our insurance. It's just that we had the best auto policy in the United States. Nobody else could beat it. But when it came to our life and our fire companies, they had their own companies they were using, and they had their own policies, so they never really sold those. So those companies were very unprofitable for us in the beginning. And George was always trying to find ways to make them more profitable, and he would do that by incentivizing the agents to sell more. Like, I'm going to give you an award if you do this, we'll recognize you for it. So he announces a sales campaign again in 1946 called $1 billion or more in 54. The idea was to get to $1 billion total dollars of general life insurance in force by 1954. We had about $500 million in place. So he figured, look, we're halfway there. We got nearly a decade to get there. We can do this no problem. And I'm going to get these agents motivated, and they're going to start selling our life insurance. But by 1949, we'd fallen to $350 million. And he realized we're not going to win this campaign. He's very frustrated. He's never failed at State Farm up to this date. And he begins to negotiate with the Ohio Farm Bureau to sell off life and fire companies. He figures, you know what, if they're not going to be profitable, we're going to get rid of them. But before he can actually get the company sold, the hero of the hour was a man by the name of A.W. Tompkins. He'd been head of agency since 1932, and what he came up with was something that state farmers call today the career agent concept. And the idea behind that was, if you want to sell State Farm insurance, you're going to have to sign a contract with us. You can only sell State Farm products, or products that we allow you to sell. You have to do it full-time, Main Street office. We'll give you compensation, benefits, all that good stuff. Oh, and one last thing. We own your book of business. That had never been done before. It's rarely done today. We're one of the few in the industry that still does it. But that ensures if the agent does not stay with us, or he retires, or we have to get rid of him, we'll just take his book of business away from him, and we'll give it to the new agent that comes through the door. George loves this idea. This makes sure that we don't lose any of our insured, so he gives a thumbs up. But the farm bureaus weren't too keen on it, so they gave a big old thumbs down, right? If a farm bureau agent decides to sign State Farm's contract, that means they're going to have to turn over their book of business to us as our property, right? So that means the farm bureaus are going to lose all their insureds. But fortunately, the law was on our side. The courts told them that farm bureaus, you never signed a contract with your agents. You don't own their book of business, they own it. And State Farm, there's nothing illegal with your contract, so if you want to sign it, go ahead. So we signed our contracts in 1954, and we split from the farm bureaus. What happens to them? It depends on what state you're in today. Some states are still our bigger competition. Texas, Iowa, Montana. Illinois, it's a powerhouse, right? Owns like 6, 7 different companies in their family. Ohio's Farm Bureau, the one we were negotiating to sell off the companies to, changes its name to Nationwide Insurance, and California's Farm Bureau changes its name to Farmers Insurance. 1954 rolls around. I should tell you that in 1951, George Mecherle has a heart attack and dies. And he had the foresight to name his successor as his son, Raymond Mecherle. So Raymond takes over in 1951. And the way that the order was structured back then was you had the chairman of the board, you had the president of mutual company, and then you had the executive vice president, right? So George was the chairman, and he dies. But instead of naming Raymond chairman of the board, Raymond's only 50 years old. We want to give George an honorific. So we are going to leave the position of chairman vacant for 5 years, and then when Raymond gets to be 55, we'll name him chairman of the board, and he can pick his successor at that point in time. Unfortunately, he doesn't make it. He passes away in 1954. So now what do? We didn't have a successor picked, but we did have that executive vice president. And that move that Adlai Rust made back in 1929 gave him a little bit of a promotion to executive vice president. So when the decision has to be made to pass the baton, it passes to Adlai Rust. And when Adlai Rust takes the company over, major change begins to happen at State Farm. Adlai realizes that in order for us to stay the leader of the industry, we have to remain innovative. We have to embrace technology if we want to do this. You know, our longest contracted vendor at State Farm is IBM. They've been on contract with us since 1928. And they love us so much and test their technology so much on us that they decided to give us one of their very first computers to install at our home office here. This is an IBM 650. We installed it 70 years ago this year. Our data processing department was established then. It is now called Enterprise Technology today. But that's where it originated from. State Farm started to figure out that, you know what, we're really big. We are really big. And there's not a lot of vendors that make stuff for us, like people, like companies this big. So we started to realize we're going to have to start building a lot of this stuff ourselves because we can't figure out anybody else can do it. So our data processing department did some amazing things through the years. I'll talk about some of those here in a little bit, but the first one I want to talk about that otherwise that Adlai did was actually had to do with seatbelts and safety restraints. Now he didn't personally have anything to do with seatbelts, but what he does begins the process of what ends up taking place in 1983. See, what Adlai did in 1954 was not only establish the data processing department, he established public affairs, he did a whole bunch of other things to try to keep us modern and innovative. He also established a research department. He realizes that if we can look at making vehicles safer, then that just means lower premiums for our customers, right? We're saving them money. So we start to study safety restraints for the first time, seatbelts specifically, and we find out almost immediately if you wear a seatbelt during a 30-mile-an-hour impact, more than likely your life is going to be saved and your injuries are going to be greatly mitigated. So the first thing we do when we had that data, we gave all State Farm employees free seatbelts. We said, please put these in your car, they could save your life someday. The next thing we did is we reached out to our competitors, think of Allstate and Progressive, and we said, hey, are you guys doing this research too? And they confirmed that they were. So instead of us reinventing the wheel every time, we all lay down our battle flags, and in 1959, we become a founding member of the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety. That's where all insurance companies work together today on research to distribute out to government agencies and manufacturers. But State Farm could not let the seatbelt thing go. They wanted it to be a requirement that auto manufacturers had to include a seatbelt in the manufacturing process. And what the auto manufacturers said was if they did that, it was going to raise the cost of a car so much, nobody would be able to afford a car again. So we called their bluff. We showed our research to a senator from Connecticut by the last name of Ribicoff. And in 1972, Senator Ribicoff was able to get regulations and stated that said, all vehicles manufactured in the United States must have safety restraints in them. But with all rules and regulations of this nation, if you don't like it, you can take it to court. And that's exactly what happened. The motor vehicle manufacturers sued. They felt this was too much federal oversight, and it goes into litigation for nearly a decade. And in 1982, by executive order, the Reagan administration overrides the regulations, allowing the auto industry to ignore them. But what they did not anticipate was State Farm's law department with 30 years of evidence showing it saves people's lives. So we sued them right back. The case is called Motor Vehicle Manufacturers of the United States versus State Farm. And in June of 1983, the Supreme Court of the United States sided with us, stating that all vehicles sold in the United States must have safety restraints in them. This now has global impact. If you're Toyota, Volkswagen, Honda, and you want to sell a car in the United States, you'll put that seatbelt in it to do so. Robots. We hear a lot about those today, but State Farm was testing robots in 1978. We partnered with a company called B&H, and they created that monstrosity you see there on the right. It's called a mailmobile. We tested it in our southern region first, and we were nervous that our employees were going to hate us for it, thinking we were replacing them. But little to our surprise, our employees loved those damn things. They put faces on them. They gave them names. We had Mel Larry and Mel Linda at the Illinois Operations Center. We had Lotus and Unlotus out in Greeley, Colorado. We had Chippendale down in Winter Haven, Florida. But there was a group of people who did not like our mailmobiles, local media. Every time we would put two of those things in one of our regional facilities, the local media would write articles about how State Farm is going to be responsible for the end of human labor in our society. I'd like to talk to those reporters today because the last mailmobile was retired in 2021 and now sits in the archive with me. So I guess it wasn't that big threat of our jobs after all. This is the other amazing device that IBM created for us, the Echo. We were trying to find a way, something for our agents to modernize them, and there was no company really out there that was creating something for us. Like I said, we're really big, so it's hard to find somebody to provide a vendor to help us out. So we worked with IBM, and they customized this device for us, this Echo. was very hard to get our agents to take it in the house. They weren't too keen on it. Computers were kind of a new thing. But this is actually a really amazing device. I have several of these in my archive. You see the computer there and then the keyboard, but right next to it, you can see Chuck Wright here has his hand on like a big dot matrix printer. But that was kind of like, it housed everything. It has the guts of it, right? And on the back side of that device is a plug that you can put a phone line into, and it says night and day on it. During the day, the agent would have the phone line plugged into his phone, and that switch was at day. And he'd work, and he'd take in applications all day, and then at night, he would flip that switch to night, plug the phone line in, and that thing would call a service center, upload applications, and download any updates. In 1980, and I was like, talking to the guy that designed this for us, and I was like, that sounds like the internet. And he's like, well, probably not. It was more like a facsimile type thing going on, but he's like, I'll tell you right now, you guys were one of the only companies in the United States doing it at the time. This works so well for us, we can't find a replacement for it today. That's how well it works. Now, it will be interesting to see if we can find one or not. This photograph actually is of a restructure that takes place in 2001 at State Farm. That regional structure did us very well. But by the 1990s, technology is starting to catch up with us. And as we all know, as we've been living the last 40 or 50 years, technology seems to happen faster and faster every day. It gets to the point where there are so many great discoveries every day, you're just kind of numb to it at this point in time, right? But back then, it took us a while to change with all that stuff, and with the digital phone lines being implemented and computers coming out, we decided we did not need to be so fractured as an organization anymore. We could actually go into 13 zones, and that's the structure that you see here with Canada at the top there. And we also changed the way we do our claims at the time period. We went into structures called the FCCs and ACCs, or Fire Claim Centrals and Auto Claim Centrals. It used to be that most of our claim reps would be out in the communities for most of the part. They'd get assigned a county, they'd have a bunch of agents assigned to them, and any claim they got, didn't matter if it was life, health, whatever, they just handle it. But in the 90s, we decided, you know, with all these computers and stuff, we can actually make it more efficient if we just have the claim handler sit in the house. We'll have a few field reps out there that are taking photographs for us, can meet customers if we need them to. But otherwise, this was a way for us to hopefully get everything done faster. And then finally, to jump ahead, quite a bit actually, because I know I'm running out of time, in 2016, State Farm becomes the first insurance company in the United States licensed to fly drones over catastrophe areas. This drone technology is absolutely amazing for us. And the reason why, you think about hurricanes today, and I'll go back to one that I experienced while I was in claims, it was Katrina. It took us weeks to get into that region to help people. But with a drone, we could fly that drone directly behind the storm, and it can begin collecting the data the second the storm passes, and we can transmit that data to claims, and they can immediately begin trying to find those people. Let's get them on the phone. Let's try to get these claims settled and get their payments made so we can get their houses rebuilt as quickly as we possibly can. This technology is absolutely amazing for us, and it keeps our claim reps safe, obviously, so they're not climbing on roofs and falling off and all that other stuff as well. And then finally, this is the new State Farm today, or at least it was prior to COVID. I think we're trying to still figure out what State Farm is going to look like now after COVID. But right before COVID hit, we were announced that we were restructuring again to what we call an enterprise-led system. I always say we go back to that because that's what we were in 1922, but nobody listens to the historian, so whatever. But we declared that the hub facilities will be opened, and we opened a hub in Dallas, Phoenix, and Atlanta. And the reason why we did that is because we needed to hire lots more people, right? And these communities that we established our regional offices in were smaller communities like Bloomington, so we didn't have enough population to pull from to staff the company. So the decision was made that we need to move to these bigger areas, and that is the State Farm that we are in today. And thank you.
Sweet. We have time for a few questions. Oh, all right, shot right up.
I want to thank I want to thank State Farm for having direct flights to Dallas.
I'll let them know.
Any questions? No? Oh my gosh, we could probably have you back again with more stories, right?
I got tons of stories. Be
Yay!
happy to
Well,
come.
we're definitely going to talk about that for the future. Truly wonderful program. Thank you so much. Buck will be here, I'm sure, for a few minutes if you have questions you do want to ask. But I once again want to thank MCK CPA Advisors for sponsoring our Lunch and Learn series and WGLT for being our live stream sponsor. We hope that you will join us next month, Thursday, July 17th, where we are going to learn about the land of the giants in Atlanta, Illinois, with Bill Thomas, curator of the American Giants Museum. So stay tuned for that, and hope you enjoy the rest of this glorious day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.